Hi everybody. We're going to do things a little bit differently this week than we might normally expect. I think usually we think of a lecture as something that begins the unit rather than ends it, but I wanted to kind of use this particular lecture to summarize not only the audio-lingual method that you've been looking at and discussing at length this past week, but also to review the grammar translation method. And the reason that I wanted to do that is that what we're going to be looking at next week, the method, is radically different from either of these two. To set the stage for this, I keep thinking back to an article by Dr. Moshe Nahir. Nahir was professor of Hebrew at the University of Manitoba in Canada, and he wrote a fabulous book on Hebrew and applied linguistics. He was himself an applied linguist. But what struck me most about Nahir's career actually was this article that he published in 1979. In that article, he analyzed all of the Hebrew programs that were published in North America that were in use at the time. And those included programs that were designed to teach Hebrew in supplementary schools, day schools, colleges, at the elementary level, at the secondary level, and of course at the college level. And in particular, what he was looking at was whether or not the program reflected the methodologies that were most current in use at the time. And he did conclude that all three of the then popular methods were reflected. Audio-lingualism, cognitivism, which we're going to be looking at a little bit later, and a kind of compromise position that tried to borrow the best from both the audio-lingual movement and from the cognitivist movement. And he concluded that all three of those trends were represented one way or the other. But his final conclusion was that the reflection of these trends has been slow and partial, with the field of Hebrew ever trailing one stage behind the theoretical and methodological mainstream. And that was certainly true in 1979. But as my recent doctoral studies have concluded, it's just as true today as it was then, which is kind of a sad commentary, but also a little bit understandable when you consider that Hebrew really is a less commonly taught language. And of course, in the world of economics, the higher the enrollment, the more likely publishers are to produce new materials and so on and so forth. And Hebrew is kind of always going to be stuck in this one stage behind position, except that Hebrew teachers, like yourselves, can break that mold by moving into the field using lots of different techniques drawn from different fields, which is why this class, I think, is so important. So one of the older methods, one of the older textbooks for teaching Hebrew as a language was B'Yad HaLashon, which was written by Reuven Yalon, who was the Director of Educational Services at the Bureau of Jewish Education in Cleveland. That is now the Jewish Education Center of Cleveland. Yalon published this book in 1967, and it really did adapt absolutely the audio-lingual methods for teaching foreign languages. It looks almost exactly like French and German textbooks I've seen for teaching in the audio-lingual method. Looks almost exactly the same. And it was very popular. It was in use all over the country. It went into I don't know how many printings. I know that we used it in the West when I was growing up. I know it was a method that had been used there. Actually, I was a little too old to actually have experienced the method, but I know they were using it. And when I moved to the East, I also found it on the bookshelves in lots of Hebrew classrooms. And aside from the fact that it had gone out of print and was not so popular, there were people that loved this particular textbook. The book that really replaced it and that became all the rage in Hebrew schools in particular was a book that came out in 1977 called Hebrew and Heritage. The author was David Bridger, who was with the Bureau of Jewish Education in Los Angeles. And he used the method, the audio-lingual method, just like B'Yad HaLashon, with a few exceptions. The book was really fun. It had lots of pictures. There was a lot of illustration of concepts and vocabulary, and things were tested by asking kids to find the sentence that matched the picture. It was definitely much more fun than B'Yad HaLashon, which was very dry. The other major difference was that every lesson was scripted. And I know that principals of schools I taught in, there were principals who absolutely insisted that teachers follow the script as written. So it was a very rigid program, even though on one level it was a more creative program. But it did make extensive use of mimicry memorization drills and pattern practice. And mimicry memorization, of course, was used for vocabulary, and pattern practice was used for drilling grammar. So again, to illustrate the principles or review the principles of the audio-lingual method, the first principle is that it uses the target language to help learners form new language habits. That means that there's no translation. Things are not translated from English to Hebrew and Hebrew to English as they are in the grammar translation method. Instead, it is just about repeating the same Hebrew phrase over and over and over and over again until hopefully the learners understand it. But the whole purpose of this is to create language habits. New vocabulary and grammatical patterns are taught through dialogues, imitation, repetition, and drills. So the dialogues are used to introduce everything, and sometimes they're acted out with puppets, sometimes they're read by the teacher, sometimes it's a choral reading with the class reading part of it and the teacher reading the other part. There's a lot of repetition of how the dialogues are used, and then there are drills, using all of the information that's been taught through the dialogues. And most importantly, errors are considered a bad thing. They are to be avoided. If an error is made, it is to be corrected immediately, kind of nip that error in the bud, as it were. Same thing occurs with grammar translation. Both of them viewed errors as a bad thing, an undesirable thing. And with the audio-lingual method, linguists went so far as to try to compare the two languages, English versus French or English versus German, to see where there were differences, because it was assumed that if a language was different from how the native language did something, that would be the source of errors. Now, of course, contrastive analysis went out of fashion, partly because they found that not all errors are the result of the languages doing things differently, and also because the whole foundation for the audio-lingual method has kind of fallen apart at the seams. So there were a number of techniques that are included in the book, in our textbook, about the different methods, different techniques in the audio-lingual method. And I will say, per se, techniques are not a bad thing. All of these can be used in one way or another, provided they're adapted a little bit, and we'll see that as we go into the next unit. But there are lots of good things about certain ones of these drills. So, for example, a chain drill, which the teacher asks the first student a question, the student answers, and then is supposed to repeat that process with the next student. So the student that has just answered now becomes the asker. The thing with this chain drill is, in an audio-lingual classroom, it's supposed to be ask the same question, get the same answer, over and over and over again, so that you're drilling the pattern, not necessarily focusing on actually answering the question. There are single slot substitution drills. That's where the teacher would give you a sentence and then give you part of that same sentence but with something missing or something changed. So for example, it's changed this from masculine to feminine. The teacher will say, Hu lomed ivrit, he. And then the student is supposed to come up with lomedet ivrit, and so on and so forth. Or multiple slot substitution drills where instead of one item being changed, 3 or 4 items are being changed, or 2 items, however many. Transformation drills, question and answer drills. Again, these are all designed to make sure that the student repeats the pattern over and over and over again. So, again, the highlights of grammar translation. Vocabulary is taught through translation and practiced through written assignments. So the students are given a word list. This is what the word is in English. This is what the word is in German. It drills the pattern. For example, verb conjugations. Here we have a sample of a French grammar translation activity where students are being asked to change from singular to plural. That is the kind of thing that is a written substitution drill. In the audio-lingual method, we had oral substitution drills. Grammar translation, they're written. And this is an example: change from singular to plural, change from masculine to feminine. Again, the focus is on the form, not on the meaning. So it's making sure the grammar is correct, and it's not really genuinely communicating. It's just using vocabulary to drill the forms. With the audio-lingual method, we find very similar kinds of things. Vocabulary is taught inductively and practiced through oral reading and drills. Now, the inductive approach to vocabulary means that it's not translated. In the audio-lingual method, vocabulary is repeated. Sometimes gestures are incorporated, sometimes pictures, but really it's only about repetition. The drill patterns, or the drills, it drills the patterns. So for example, verb conjugations, substitution drills. These are oral. Grammar translation is written. Again, change from singular to plural, change from masculine to feminine, and again here the focus is on form, not on meaning. So the grammar translation method is really easy to categorize and classify. It is clearly a cognitive method. It treats language learning exactly the same way that it treats learning geography. It's memorization and application of the pattern. Naturalistic. So with the audio-lingual method, the question is it naturalistic or is it cognitive? And I can see that there are arguments on both sides. On the naturalistic side, there is a focus on spoken language. That's a key in naturalistic approaches. There is no translation to the first language. That's also very key to naturalistic approaches. It uses an inductive approach to introduce grammatical items. In other words, students are not given a lecture on how the grammar works. They're given examples, and they're supposed to, the examples induce that kind of thinking so that the student gradually comes to understand it. On the cognitive side, I can also make arguments about grammar translation. There is a focus on form, not on content. That is true in both of these methods. It's just that one does it in written language and the other does it in spoken. But the focus is on form, not on meaning, not on communication, not on getting a message from one person to the next. Both view errors as bad. We can argue about whether that's true or not, but it is something that one finds in most cognitive methods. Not all of them, but most of them. Now with grammar translation, not with grammar translation, with audiolingualism, what brought it down so that it's not really used in most places any longer, it's really out of fashion, is that the foundation of this method is really flawed. Language is not habitual. Language is creative. We know that language speakers form sentences they have never heard before, ever. They use words in ways that they have not been introduced to this. A quick story. When I was principal of a Hebrew school, we had an oral language program. Teacher would come in and visit each of the classrooms for 10 minutes and do a quick oral language lesson. So she was in working with a group of young students. They were just in the middle of their primer year. And the teacher gave out to every student a pencil and a paper cup, and each one had a notebook. So she was reviewing the different prepositions, and she asked each student to go around the room and to create a scene with these items and to make a sentence out of it in Hebrew. So one kid put the pencil in the cup and said, Ha'iparon bakos. Another put the book next to the notebook next to the cup and said, Hamachberet al yad hakos, and so on and so forth. It went around the room. Towards the end of the group, there was a student who really, really wanted to create a brand new sentence. So he reached into his pocket, he pulled out 25 cents, he dropped the quarter into the cup and said, Tzedakah bakos. This is not a sentence he had ever heard. None of his classmates said it. His teacher had not modeled it. This was simply the kid being creative with the language. That is how language works. It is a creative act. So clearly, if it's not habitual, if it is creative, it's not based on repeating the same thing that you've heard over and over and over again. This tells us that with language learning, something else is going on. What that is that's going on is what we are going to cover next week.